In this lecture, we'll go over the different options available for the world's units of measurement. So basically, you can have the world measured using the metric system, or imperial units, or even Blender's own units of measurement. So let's go over to the scene properties right here, and we'll expand the units panel right there. Now the first option here is just the unit system. You can set it to metric or imperial. You can even set it to none, which is Blender's own unit of measurement. It's basically the same as metric in terms of how the grid is spaced out, but there's no meters or feet on the end or anything like that. Now the unit scale value here is used to fix some issues you might encounter when working on the microscopic scale or on the larger astronomical scales. At those scales you might encounter some issues with precision. For example, if you're working with extremely large models like planets, you might want to increase the unit scale in order to scale down the grid and in turn make all of your objects measure larger without actually scaling the objects. And I think this is what prevents any numerical precision problems in Blender from popping up. I never had this issue, but if I understand it right, Blender doesn't like when you scale objects extremely large or extremely small. So the workaround for that is to simply scale the grid instead. So let me set this back to 1. This has another troubleshooting use as well. Let's say we were modeling our scene and we were accidentally modeling everything in centimeters instead of meters. For example, let me change the dimensions of the cube here down to 2 centimeters. So let's say we created our entire scene and then we noticed everything was in the wrong measurements. So everything's in centimeters right now, but I wanted this to be 2 meters, not 2 centimeters. So we can simply change the unit scale by multiplying it by 100, and that converts 2 centimeters to 2 meters. And now without having to scale everything in the scene, we just corrected the measurements with one simple change in the field right here. So let me undo all of that now and zoom out a little bit, get back to our default scene here. Next up is this really handy option here called separate units. For example, let's take the location of the cube and change it on the x-axis up to 1.5 meters. And it actually says 1.5 meters too. It doesn't say 1 meter, 50 centimeters. We can make it say that by enabling separate units. You can see how that changed up here. So that can be really handy if you want to work with meters and centimeters at the same time, not have to work with decimals that much. And this works for imperial as well. So for example, if we move this over 1.5 feet, it says 1 foot 6 inches. If we disable separate units, it simply says 1.5 feet. Now I'll show you one other trick that's especially useful for those using the imperial system. So let me reset the X location back to 0, and I'll go into top view here. Now each one of these blocks here represents 1 foot. For example, if I press G, hold Control for grid snapping, and I move it over 3 blocks, that moves it over 3 feet. But when I zoom in, you can see each one of those 1 foot blocks gets divided by 10 instead of 12. So if I press G and then hold Control for snapping, and I move it over 3 increments, it moves it over 3.6 inches instead of 3 inches. And that's again because each 1 foot block gets divided by 10 instead of 12, so we can't move it over 1 perfect inch at a time when we're snapping. So in order to get 12 divisions between each 1 foot increment, we can go up to the viewport display menu here. Which one is it? Yeah, it's this one here. And we can change the grid subdivisions here from 10 to 12. And now we have 12 divisions in each 1 foot block. So now when I press G to move it, hold Control for snapping, and I move it over 3 increments, you can see it moved over a perfect 3 inches. So that's exactly what we would want if we were using the imperial system. Now that may be useful for your measurements, or you might still opt to keep things default, but that option can definitely come in handy. So let me reset this back to metric, and I'll reset this back down to 10. Now all of the options at the bottom here are used as the defaults for measuring your scene and objects. Length here, for example, is the default measurement for the grid. If you're building something like a character or a car, the default option might be best for you. But if you're building something smaller, you might want to work with smaller units of measurements like centimeters or millimeters or whatever. So you can change that here, and the other fields here are similar in concept. And that's basically all there is to it. And just as a side note, I want to stress the importance of modeling things with the correct scale. If you model everything to a real world scale, then you can easily reuse your models in different scenes, and they'll all be scaled correctly in those scenes. If you ignore scale as you're modeling things, then you might import a model into your scene and it'll end up being too small or too big, and you'll need to adjust it. This can also affect shaders as well, so it's just better to keep real world scale in mind whenever you're creating something. So that's going to do it for this lecture though, and I'll see you in the next one.